Welcome. Welcome to our meeting. My name is Lauren Persiunco. I'm the Executive Director of the Data3 Initiative, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our third regulatory roundtable on data sandboxes, climate, and sustainability challenges in Africa. Before we start, I encourage you to introduce yourselves in the chat. Tell us where you come from, and please turn on your cameras to make sure this event is more interactive. We pride ourselves of having events that are very lively, where people exchange ideas in the chat and introduce each other. And so we'd like you to continue with that that practice that we have. As you probably noticed today, the event is being recorded, and we'll be sharing the recording on YouTube, so to share with those that couldn't join us live. And now some information on what we are doing here today. Trusted data sharing is urgently needed to promote collaboration and innovation between different stakeholders, scientists, governments, private sector, civil society, in order to implement effective climate response measures. The issue of climate crisis is really an all hands on deck issue. And that's why the Data3 Initiative is on a mission to build agile frameworks to responsibly unlock the value of data for all, to make sure that we have informed decisions and the data needed to address this problem. For those that are not familiar with our work, we are a nonprofit organization dedicated to fostering global collaboration on the technical and policy solutions for the multidimensional and cross-border challenges of data governance. And we bring together diverse voices from different sectors to conduct research, experiment with policy and technical solutions, and work closely with decision makers to enact data governance narratives change in their narratives and strategies. And today's roundtable is part of our Africa Forum Sandboxes for Data, a project which was made possible by the generous support of the William and Flora Hewlett Foundation. And through this initiative, we aim to convene leaders in government, industry, academia, civil society, and technical communities to address cross-border data challenges, in particular in Africa. And our focus today is on data, climate, and sandboxes in Africa. We are here to explore the potential of unlocking the value of data and using sandboxes as a tool to foster experimentation and innovation in addressing the climate crisis. We recognize the unique challenges and opportunities that Africa faces in the context of climate change and sustainability, and we're here to share the insights and best practices on how data-driven innovative solutions can be effectively implemented to promote environmental health and sustainable development. This is our third roundtable in the series. In our previous sessions, we delved into the general uses, benefits, and challenges of designing sandboxes in Africa, and as well as the intersection between sandboxes and artificial intelligence. And if you missed those sessions, the recordings are available in our YouTube channel. And then, but first, we wanted to hear from you, and we'll be sharing the answers at the end of the session. We have developed a few questions now that you can respond now via Menti, and we'll look into the how you're feeling about them at the end. You can access the Menti through the link that my colleagues are sharing in the chat below, or by scanning the QR code that you see now in your screens. And the Menti questions are about how you feel about climate and climate data in terms of their availability and importance for this issue. So I invite you to answer those questions so that we see how you feel. And then finally, I wanted to invite you to enrolling in our online course, A Guide to Cross-Border Sandboxes for Data. And we have a particular module in Africa Sandboxes experience as well. At the end of it, you become a certified sandboxer upon completion. And my colleagues should be sharing the link for enrollment in the chat as well. So now, without further ado, I'd like to hand over the virtual stage to Dina Montagui. Dina is the Environmental Justice Lecturer at Stanford University, as well as the founder and executive director of Energy Rich, an early stage startup establishing local manufacturing of solar systems in Ghana. She'll be moderating the first panel, which is on data collaboration to address climate change.
Thank you, Lorraine. Wonderful. Thank you, and thank you to everybody joining us. And so this session will delve into the unique challenges and opportunities that Africa faces in the context of climate change and sustainability. So sharing insights and best practices on how data-driven solutions can be effectively regulated and implemented to promote environmental health and sustainable development. So we are fortunate to have three wonderful speakers with us today. And each speaker will have about 3 minutes to respond to our questions. And so I would first like to introduce Sarah Faruqi. Sarah is a member of the Tools and Technology team and the Digital Impact Alliance. Her primary role is to serve as the product owner of the Digital Impact Exchange, which aims to connect digital development practitioners to the tools and guidance they need. Welcome, Sarah. We are also joined by Banu Nupain, and Banu Nupain is the advisor for ICT and science and open access to scientific information at UNESCO in Paris. His work focuses on conceptualizing, developing, implementing, monitoring, and evaluating open solutions in the area of ICT and sciences, and support for multilingualism in the cyberspace. He has worked in projects managing hydrological and climate change programs across South and Central Asia. Welcome, Banu. And we are also joined by Boniface Akuku. And Boniface provides leadership for and support organizations' digital transformation aligned with their strategies and needs. He leads digital acceleration to develop rapid, on-demand digital challenges for organizations and government ministries of agriculture in the Africa region and other developing countries. He also supports creative partnership networks, connecting organizations to resources in the digital transformation agenda, working as a digital champion, energizing and supporting diverse organizations and governments in transforming and enabling agricultural digitally. Thank you for all of our guests. And Sarah, I would like to start with you. And if you could discuss what are the main challenges in deploying innovative technologies for sustainability and climate resilience in Africa, and how can these obstacles be overcome to foster a more sustainable future?
Yeah, thank you, Dina. Good to be here. Thank you for having me here. So at the Digital Impact Alliance, we are focused on foundational digital technology or digital public infrastructure, which are the essential building blocks that help build better public services. And the common understanding is that DPI is comprised of digital identification systems, digital payment structures, and data exchange. And the idea is that with modular and interoperable DPI in place, a wide variety of public services across different sectors can be provided to communities and individuals. Now, for climate resilience, the data exchange component of DPI is extremely critical. It's outsized in comparison to digital IDs and digital payment structures, which is more important for, some other sectors. And we know that a range of climate relevant data sets already exists, so these are things like information on weather patterns, tide levels, agriculture, even data on things like transportation patterns, foot traffic, and energy consumption. And the use cases for climate is quite vast. But as climate change events and impacts increase in frequency and intensity, policymakers and scientists across the world need access to as much data as possible. So the challenges that we are seeing and tracking at DIAL, and these are relevant to the African context, but they have global applicability. They arise from the data not being accessible, not being available, not being usable, and not being shareable. So you can imagine something like a flooding scenario. There may be national level projections for flood damage, but unless the data is available at the community level, it is difficult to direct the resources, very precisely. So when we say that data is not available, we're talking about the scale of data at the granular level. So this is required, for the climate action to be effective. And there is a little bit of a mismatch between national commitments for climate and the goals that are and the goals that countries and governments have, and then the subnational availability of that data. The second layer of challenges, these are accessibility challenges, and these cover a host of issues, including skills and capacity gaps, absence of regulation and policy, and most importantly, it's the resource constraints and the barriers to accessing the finances to mobilizing the effective data sharing. And then if the data is both available and accessible, at times the data is not usable, and that's due to the inconsistencies or the inaccuracies or the lack of standardization. This can really hinder the ability to analyze and interpret the data effectively. And the usability challenges, they also include issues such as data privacy and security concerns, which are really important when you're trying to build and design for the communities. And then finally, when the data could be available, it could be accessible and usable, but the data might not be shareable because the technical mechanisms for sharing the data are not standardized and they're not interoperable. So this makes it really difficult for stakeholders to exchange data seamlessly. And this leads to patterns of challenges, including fragmentation, siloed data sets, and unmet potential for the data itself. So more than that, the issues such as data ownership and intellectual property rights and lack of proper data governance frameworks can further hinder that sharing of data. So I think that without solving that technology piece and the financing models and mechanisms for data sharing, it's going to remain a challenge to achieve sustainability goals overall.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And Banu, could you respond to that question as well? What are the main challenges that you see in deploying innovative technologies for sustainability and climate resilience in Africa? And how can these obstacles be overcome to foster a more sustainable future?
Yes, thank you so much, Dana. Before I begin, I must say that I'm a climate scientist, so my response may be slightly tilted toward maybe climate change issues more than data issues. But I just did a very quick Google search, Google Scholar search. And if you actually look at the total number of research that has been published on Africa and climate change, it comes to about 16,200 research papers have been published since 2020. And if you see that, even if you do a very quick scan of these documents, you will find, majority of them talking about both, the quality as well as, quantity of data that are available to do different types of a modeling exercise. Climate change, of course, is a global phenomenon, and it's very and impacts, but its impacts are very much felt closer on the ground. It's a system challenge, which many of us try to ignore, and then we think that it's a global, that the temperature is increasing by 1.5 degree, and understanding of that itself will suffice. But that is not. And I think what we require is we require a finer scale data. This is something Sarah already mentioned. And I think one of the things which we actually need is a capacity to be developed in Africa to downscale data. Because I did also another quick scan, and I found that about 20 different satellites are in fact like hovering on top of Africa, even as we speak right now, collecting different type of data. Whether you talk about Meteosat or TRMM or like here on RC, and in fact there are a couple of very interesting satellite-based program that Africa itself has developed. And I found that, these are collecting quite a lot of data, but these data are at a different coarser scale. And these need to be somehow, converted into a downscale to finer scale so that, they can be utilized for different modeling and then, to generate solutions for Africa. One of the things that I also found that the way Africa is urbanizing, quite interestingly, Africa is urbanizing at a different scale than other continents. In fact, if you look at Kinshasa, for example, current level of, total number of people living there, about 16 million, and by 2035, about 26 million people will be living there. So many of these, the climate change impacts are taking place there at city scale, and the information are available, at a different scale altogether. So I think, there needs to be a lot of things, that can be done on this one. So one thing, that we need to do is to perhaps, develop downscaling techniques. And I think on this, we can very easily develop a sandbox. And I was, in fact, thinking about, floating into the team here. Perhaps we should think about developing a project on downscaling techniques, using, whatever scale data, that is available, and then, fitting it to the scale so that the finer scale solutions could be developed for Africa. So, just to tell you, it's all about the lack of finer scale data is the biggest challenge in Africa. Over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And if I could just remind the speakers, and you have a wealth of information to share with us, but if we could keep the responses to about 3 minutes for reasons of time. Thank you so much. Okay, excellent. And also, Boniface, if you could respond to that question as well. And you're on mute right now, so if you could. Yes.
Sorry, yeah.
No
sorry
problem.
for that. Yes, yeah. I think one of the challenges that we are seeing, and we really need to be careful about, is how to ensure that the data we get is quality. Because one of the challenges that we are facing, particularly in the context of Africa, is basically how do we access quality data? Because of the price and the ability the ability to get quality data is a challenge. And the other challenge, I think, we're also seeing here is the challenge of capacity. So capacity remains another big challenge for us, which I think we really need to consider. How do we address the issues of capacity? Because those remains very, very, very major challenges around what we're doing here. Yet, the demand for data, particularly around climate data, continue to rise. We have aspects like microclimate, which are basically making us realize that we need to really use innovative technologies. We really need strategies on which are critical for us, yet we lack capacity in many quarters, whether from building innovations, building models, using the output of the models, and how then to make sure that the data is available, and even also not just the data being available, how can the use cases become usable? Because it's one thing to build a use case, it's another thing for it to be used. So the main challenges that are basically we are grappling with here are capacity issues, the challenges around having quality, which is basically compromised by having the particular publicly available that is available. But how do you then make it, process it so that can be used easily or can run models effectively. So that remains a challenge. So it's available, but there's lack of skills that can be able to make sure that this the data which is publicly available is in a form that can be used to run the models and also to provide usable use cases. So I would maybe stop it there for now because I know there are other questions coming, but I wanted just to measure around the two issues, two challenges. Yeah, back to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for all of these very insightful responses. And so my next question is, how can traditional environmental knowledge contribute to more effective and sustainable climate resilience strategies in Africa? And Sarah, if we could start with you again, that would be wonderful.
Yeah, sure. So I think, a couple of things have come up with the other two speakers as well. And Banu mentioned that this is, a systems challenge. And that's what we see, that climate change is, it is a crisis multiplier, which means that food and water, energy, public health, even political stability outcomes are all directly impacted by this challenge that we're faced with. And we all know that the outlook, the climate change outlook that we have for the planet it's quite grim. So which means that nothing short of us being very bold and working collectively towards this problem can be applied to tackle it. So in Africa's case, it is one of the more vulnerable continents to climate change, even though it's only responsible for a fraction of the greenhouse gas emissions. So the imperative for action is there, and this includes the imperative for digital innovation, which can only be effective if it is applied in conjunction with local communities. So ultimately, the digital technology that is being imported, it can only be effective if it is supporting the agency of the local communities, if it is reflective of their culture and values, and if it is incorporating the indigenous knowledge and practices that already exist. So things like sustainable farming or rainwater harvesting, coastal preservation, so on and so forth. And these communities, they have the traditional knowledge of the environment. And so when we talk about digital technologies, starting from the design and then the build and then the implementation, it must amplify these voices if it's to be successful. So the frameworks and the regulations for data privacy and security, that's one of the focal points. And these programs need to design this collectively and kind of amplify these voices that have their concerns about some of these data privacy and security issues. And then we see that, local communities, they are the best resource for knowing what the cultural heritage is like, what the how to empower the economic opportunities, safeguard the traditional practices, and that comes down to what my other colleague on the panel mentioned, investing in the capacity building for the marginalized communities and providing tailored communications so that they know that they are a part of the process. I think I'll stop there and wait for the next question. Thanks.
Excellent. Somebody who's very invested in environmental justice, I love to hear these responses around building the capacity and working with communities as well. Banu, if you could also respond to that question as well. How can traditional environmental knowledge contribute to more effective and sustainable climate resilience strategy in Africa?
I think there is a full like branch of science in the citizen science and crowdsourcing, and I think that has somehow been neglected. Or even if they have been used, we are in fact using them just to count.
Sorry, Banu, to interrupt for just one quick second. If you could move closer to the mic so we could hear you a bit clearer.
This is the closest that I can be.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
Anyways, as I was saying, citizen science is somewhat, I think is misused or less used in Africa. Primarily, this technique is used to count, different species of bird or some of the local phenomena that happens. But I think local people can even with simple, say, devices, can really contribute to ground truthing of the data. So this is one thing, that can be enhanced. The other thing is, of course, the citizens have been, or the traditional knowledge have been very effectively utilized to develop predictive models. I think this is another area that needs, and I think the body of knowledge is there, and all it requires is to be utilized in Africa more than what the level that it has been utilized right now. The other thing that I think one of our colleagues already mentioned, that capacity building is absolutely needed, but capacity building at what? Is it simply to train them to use new technology, or collect more data, or in fact use them also as user of those data? So I think they're simply being regarded as provider of the data, not so much as user of data. So I think I think this dimension must change. The other thing which is extremely important is to see where some of these knowledge are dying. I think there is a coordinated approach to record and then safeguard some of these traditional knowledge that doesn't exist, or even if they exist, the effort is there essentially to modernize them than other things. So I think that's another thing. And I will also say that in Africa has been a cradle of social networking and knowledge sharing. So some of these like existing say effort needs to be somehow revived and utilized in climate monitoring. Over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for bringing up these important points about safeguarding, about ground truthing. And Boniface, if you could add on to that as well about your perspective on traditional environmental knowledge and data.
Yeah, I'll speak about 5 points in this because this is an area I've been working on very closely. I think what I want to start by saying is that Africa survived with traditional environmental knowledge before digital innovation came into place. There are those we used to call rainmakers, and what they were using was actually science. The only thing that was not documented, because they lose things like vector movement, wind movement, wind speed. Vector is a very big component of traditional knowledge. But then that doesn't work very well now because of microclimate. The climate has changed, and therefore those traditional knowledge and method and approaches cannot cope with the changes in the climate, and particularly around the microclimate. And therefore, the integrating digital innovation and traditional knowledge can contribute in 5 ways. Number 1 is triangulation. We can use the traditional knowledge and the digital innovation to triangulate and come with better digital innovations, because we cannot rely on traditional knowledge only now. We have to use other innovative approaches such as modeling, radar technology, to be able to get the best outcome from the models. The second contribution I would say here is comparative analysis. By combining these 2 approaches, you're able to do comparison. For example, in some other African community, they would slaughter a goat to check the intestine of a goat to predict the weather. And therefore, you can do comparative analysis where you use the more digital tools, digital innovation, and basically compare with the outcome from the traditional knowledge. But how many goats can you slaughter to predict the weather? It means you'd slaughter a lot of goats, and therefore using that knowledge for comparative analysis will be critical so that you can confirm that the digital tools are working, so you can rely on digital tools as opposed to relying on indigenous knowledge only. Then the validation of the digital innovation. Again, it's critical to validate what my colleagues say, ground truthing, so that you can be sure that whatever you're getting from the digital innovation is actually in tandem with knowledge that have been used before. And then the last is citizen engagement. By trying to combine the 2, where you appreciate the knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and then the community begin to see that it is actually giving the same results. The digital innovators give the same results as their knowledge, then the citizen engagement becomes easier, which will lead into more usability and application of digital innovations. But if they're distant from what the indigenous knowledge is, then they will get some resistance in adoption and impact. Thank you.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And I appreciate all of you kind of talking about how these modern technologies and traditional environmental knowledge can really work together. And so finally, I would like to ask, what strategies can be employed to ensure that African communities are not just recipients, but active participants in the development and implementation of data-driven solutions to climate change? And how can these solutions be made accessible, safe, and adaptable at the community level? So I would love to start with you again.
Sure. So at Dial, we steward something called the Principles of Digital Development, and these are 9 design principles. So the starting point is really to design intentionally for keeping the rights of communities and marginalized groups as a focus for climate resilience interventions for any digital innovation, in fact. So this, consulting and doing social impact assessments, these things need to be conducted not just for the buy-in from the local communities, but also to give them the agency and ownership of the digital technologies that are being built and implemented. And then if we were to succeed in using digital technologies in support of the environment, the interventions cannot just be imported, so to speak. They cannot be reactive responses, but they have to be forward facing. And so there are open source building block approaches. So for example, the one that's being championed by GovStack, this allows for this type of customization, which every country can kind of build their own or chart their own course for what is required and what is most kind of usable in their context. And then I would say that providing opportunities or creating mechanisms for opportunities of public-private partnerships where governments and organizations can borrow expertise from local businesses or academia as well, or providing peer learning networks that create this exchange of information that can help overcome challenges, share resources, and also share solutions and talk about those solutions. And even better, we can create that shared infrastructure and create those open solutions as well. It's not lost that data exchange it's a very sensitive issue for national governments, and for good reasons, because there are cybersecurity issues and data protection issues that are cropping up all over. But it can be very cost prohibitive to think about just keeping the data locally and hosting it locally or mirroring it locally to protect the data from attacks. So working on trust, building trust it's a big issue. So technology needs to be built in a way that it's embodying this trust, and it's addressing the concerns, and it's including local communities, national governments in these in these structures, so that they know what they're so that they have an ownership in the process, essentially. So I think that digital interventions for climate purposes, it's no longer optional. It has to become mainstream. We need the early warning systems to provide messages on phones of individuals to say, this is happening. But in the same vein, individuals need to be able to report that the climate events that they have firsthand access to before even the government does, such as like a pest infestation to crops or something like that. They need to be able to report that back as well. So the programs and digital solutions cannot just be designed for communities, but they should be led by communities, and they should consider the safeguarding of the solutions in order to make it really usable and really, accepted by the local communities as well.
Excellent. Thank you so much for those responses. And Banu, if you could follow up with that. What strategies can be employed to ensure that African communities are not just recipients, but active participants in the development and implementation of data-driven solutions to climate change? And how can these solutions be made accessible, safe, and adaptable at the community level?
Thank you so much. One of the things that has not properly been done in Africa is the real stakeholder analysis. In fact, who are communities? Is community one person? Community involves women? Community involves young people? Community involves leaders, indigenous population, everything. So I think when we are to develop something, and try to merge indigenous and indigenous technology with the modern technology. I think inclusive participation is the key. So I think we will have to somehow ensure how the diverse representation of different groups that I mentioned is there. And perhaps all of these groups require different level of capacity to function. And of course, they also have some certain capacity which can be utilized or mainstream in developing solutions. But at the same time, they also lack capacity, which requires targeted capacity building. So that is also something that needs to be considered. The other thing is also recognition and integration of traditional. Sarah already mentioned about it. How can the traditional local knowledge be mainstreamed in the modern technology? And this is something that requires a participatory planning and then somewhat ownership building of the overall thing. Most of the time, it's something that is imported from outside, gets dumped on people, so it becomes basically impractical in all possible sense of the word, because it requires a different set skill set, but at the same time, different data set to implement. So somehow, this ownership building process needs to precede any of these, like integration mechanism that goes in. The other thing is also is somehow the people who bring technology from outside, in a sense, we think that these people do not know anything. So I think somehow we have to say that they have got something, and most of the time I basically resent a word. I think we don't build capacity, but we enhance capacity. So perhaps like the entire model of capacity building or within this spectrum must change into capacity enhancement rather than capacity building. So of course there is some a technological barrier that needs to be removed, and for that one I think we have got very nice programs already developed in different parts. One thing that is happening is somehow we think that everything needs to be new. We are not building on something that has already been implemented and have been found successful in other parts of the world. Because developing countries, whether it's Africa or whether it's sub-Saharan in subcontinent in South Asia or in Latin America, the characteristics of the community is exactly the same. So I think there needs to be some kind of like bridging or learning from some of these things that have already happened in different parts of the world. So this is also an extremely important for us to do. The final and most important thing is to empower communities through ownership of data and models. Because most of the time, whatever gets built, it becomes somebody else's property. Which I said earlier, CNRS may have more data and models about Africa than Africa continent put together. Over to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much for those answers, and it gives us a lot of food for thought. And finally, if we could end with Boniface, if you could also respond to the idea of strategies, ensuring that communities are not just recipients and active participants instead.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, so I'll talk about what to call an adhesion process to make the community not participants, but also just recipient, but to be participant, is to go whenever you're building all these systems, technologies, innovations, or solutions, you need to go through a process we call an adhesion process. So the adhesion process talks about co-creation, co-validation. So all the systems, solution, innovation that are being designed, being developed, should take place through co-develop, co-creation. So we should co-create together with the communities and co-validate the results with the community. Now, it's easier said than done. We have read this thing in theory in classes. We have taught them. I mean, we've taught adhesion process. We have taught co-creation, co-validation. But the secret, the strategy here, which I've also used practically and has worked very well, is start by addressing the pain points of the communities. So when you are actually aiming at addressing or solving the pain points of the communities. So in that case, then you must understand what are the pain points, what are you trying to address regarding climate change. Then your solution will not just be top down, but actually will be bottom up, because you basically have to take time to understand what are the pain points, what are the challenges they're having, how can it be solved. So in that process, once you understand the pain points and your goal is to address the pain points, then the community will not just be recipient, but will be participant. So then you adhere together, you test together, you pilot together, deploy together. And this is one of the ways. Now, what are for accessibility and adaptability? For one thing you must do is understand the barriers. What are the barriers to access, use, and adapt? So once you understand the barriers to access, barriers to use, then you will be able to basically ensure that whatever is being built is accessible and is usable. It can be, there are three problems you must address. Most time we address availability, but availability do not translate to accessibility, and accessibility do not translate to usability. So you make the solutions available, accessible, and usable. And then lastly, what you must also take into account is we need to move from beyond science to theory, or beyond theory to practice, beyond science or beyond theory to practice. So if we remain at science, we remain at innovation, we remain at theory, we will not be able to make the solutions accessible and adaptable, but we must move to practice. We must have a practice lens. And to have a practice lens, we need to build the solution with the user in mind, but more importantly, to be able to get feedback and build whatever we're building on open standard so that it becomes adaptable. So you get feedback, but if you don't have an open standard or open systems, then you're not able to adapt. So let me leave it there because of time. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much. And for all of you, you're bringing up really important points about the idea of co-creation, about the idea of capacity enhancing rather than capacity building, about peer learning networks. And I'm just wondering if each of you could maybe discuss specific examples that you have seen where these practices have worked well. Because as you said, it is very difficult to move from theory to practice. And so where have you seen these specific, success stories within your work?
So do you want me to start?
Any of you could say, yes, please, one of us. Please go ahead and start.
Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, fine. Yes, so I've been a practitioner, and one of my philosophy is practice call. I mean, if it's not being used, then it's not built. It's not usable. In fact, normally I built my climate platform in 2016, and I said if my mother can't use it, then it's it's useless. Now, so specific example is where you look at we looked at now what are basically the barriers that will be able to hinder use. And one of the barriers we found was actually a language. And therefore, one of the things we try to do is to translate some of the messaging or advisories that we're providing into local languages. Of course, natural language models was not there then. With natural language models now, it's easier to just translate it into local languages. So that is one area to ensure there's adaptability. Now, once I sent messages to farmers, and I had 100 farmers, and the message was, if there's too much water in your farm, please prepare a drainage. And none of those farmers understood me. So I explained what I was trying to do. And they said, oh, you'd have told us if there's too much water in your farm, remove the water. Because removing the water we know, but the drainage you don't know. So changing just from prepared drainage to remove water made a whole lot of difference. So how do we make the information or the messages be able to take into account the capacity and the level of understanding of the communities that we intend to serve with our innovations and our solutions? And therefore, it's what we call transforming the messages, transforming the information and the solution to be able to be used within the capacity of the community you are trying to serve. And number two, another practical example, we found that most of the communities are not aware of the value and existence of the digital solution, digital innovations. And therefore, we embarked on creating awareness by getting a few, for example, in this case, farmers who are able to know the value, adapt the value, and be the ambassadors that are speaking about the value and about the importance of this solution. And we did that. And when the farmers started seeing that their fellow farmers were understanding, the fellow farmers were speaking about the benefit. I remember once a woman said, if I had this information 5 years ago, all my children would have gone to school, because now I'm using this for my phone and I'm able to make profit for my farm. The climate is no longer a problem to me, and I'm able to pay school for my children. And all the women in that village went and bought phones. Another instance is a case where one of the platform built is called the Kenya Agriculture Observatory. In fact, if you Google YouTube, how Nakuru farmers are using KOP, you will find it on YouTube, where farmers said, before this solution, we used to look at the sky, and the sky will cheat us, to rain, and to never rain. Today, I don't look at the sky, I look at my phone, and my phone has not cheated me, and I'm making profit. It's because when we design the solution, we design the solution in a way that is able to address the pain points of these farmers. The pain points were the forecasts were not accurate, the forecasts were not localized, the forecasts were not timely. And so looking at what are the challenges are untimeliness, they are not localized, the language is complex, and the tool is complex. So it's made simple. You just go, click on your account, on your word, and then you get the forecast. So that's one practical example on co-creation, co-validation, and also trying to address the pain points. So you start by addressing the real pain points of the communities. Back to you.
Excellent. It's really nice to have a vision of how this can practically work and be successful. And Banu and Sarah, do you have any specific examples where you've seen successes?
I don't want to go first, I'll give the floor. Otherwise, I just have, a very small example to note. This example is, we had a project called, Mountain Environmental Virtual Observatory. Primarily in mountain area, some of you may know the telemetry is not there, so telecommunication is not there, so automatic data loggers will not work. So if we are trying to develop, say, hydrological, meteorological, even like crop prediction, crop calendars, we require almost data to be recovered from these areas on real time. So what we had done was, we had developed a small low-cost sensor and worked with the community in Kyrgyzstan, in Ethiopian highlands, in Nepal, Himalayas, and in Peru. So what we did was, we gave this community a very small to use sensor, and community were using those sensor, and they also knew that, if the longer term forester level climate data is given, something that they can utilize, or get it from their phone, they could in fact, predict whether or not the rainfall is likely in the next couple of days, and whether or not the fertilizers need to be whether or not the fields need to be fertilized or not, or even, like the insecticide, whether or not, this will be sprayed or not, because if immediately after they spray the fertilizer, the insecticide, if the rain falls, everything will get washed up. So some of these calendars they were developing based on this very simple to utilize data logger and this simple sensor that we have developed. And the sensors were costing just $25 per piece. And then, in fact, we had a life of about 2 years. So, $25 solution was working much more effectively than some of the $1 million applications that we have in there. So local people can do magic.
Excellent. Thank you so much. And before we hear the response from Sarah, I just want to encourage everybody who's online. If you do have a question, please submit it. Et bonjour à tout le monde qui parle français. Si vous avez une question en français aussi, vous pouvez poser des questions. Okay, Sarah, if you could also provide some examples, this would be wonderful.
Sure. So I think one example that I can provide from a partner of Dial's actually, it's the Climate Emergency Software Alliance. They're based out of Indonesia, and Indonesia is a country which actually has a gamut of, it's a high risk for a gamut of climate issues, including things like hurricanes and flooding and earthquakes and volcanoes. I mean, I think they have like 9 or 10 different high risk level status for different climate events. So what this partner did was, when they were trying to solve for the community, and the issue is about kind of resource mobilization when something hits, when an earthquake hits, or when a flooding disaster hits. How does the government kind of provide or disseminate all of their resource mobilization to help that? And what they were running into, or what they realized was a problem, was that while there is flood predictions of how flooding will impact the local community, it's not always very clear how it will translate in real time on the ground. And what they realized was that people were using social media to kind of just say that I'm stuck on my rooftop and I'm here, and they would put up a picture. So all they did was they started mapping that on a map. So anytime there was activity on Twitter, that would then be kind of built onto a map. And then the government was able to use that information and say, okay, well, this is a hot point. And there's, 300 people stranded here, and we need to send some help, some emergency help here. So they were able to kind of build this software. It's completely open. It was using openly available information. The data was anonymized, and they were able to provide real help. And now that has translated where now the government is actually using that software, and they're able to create that in an interoperable way and feed that back into. So the software is using all the government predictability data on the 9 different kind of disasters that they are prone to, and they're feeding that into their social media based software. And then the government is also now using that to make sure that their resources are being mobilized. And what's really interesting about this example is that was then used beyond Indonesia, because it's completely open source. So other countries have now started taking that and started using that. And now they're faced with another challenge, I think, which happens naturally, is how do you scale and in a sustainable fashion in which you're growing, but you're able to kind of keep up with the growth and scale meaningfully as well, and impact, provide the impact that's required for other communities as well. So I think that example really sticks out, that it's software being built well. It's also keeping in mind the local conditions and the local the local communities are participating and building it. So yeah, thanks, Dina.
Excellent. Thank you all so much. We have about 2 minutes left. I have a million questions for all of you. But I just want to maybe briefly, this is kind of a big question, but in just like a few minutes, how do you deal with power dynamics? I mean, we talk about co-creation, but everybody is coming from institutions which represent a certain amount of strength. So how do you deal with those power dynamics when you're working in community?
I think if I could go first again, yes, that is true. For example, if you come from an institution from a research institute, which is basically I worked in a research institution for 10 years, you find that their focus is addressing the peer-reviewed journals, I mean, scientific writing, to address their focus is how do I get promoted? How does my work get recognized? So the focus has been for the research community, publish or perish. But I think in 2012, I changed the dynamics by trying to tell them impact or perish. So you have to basically come up with because it's not very easy to change people from their orientation unless you present to them a great idea. So here you have to really present the value that they gain to get on top of because the power dynamic is actually about value and about somebody being conscious about his own, what is benefiting, what's stand to lose, what's stand to gain. And therefore, you must first of all present to them that you're not threatening their value, but you're adding something on top of what they're doing. So when I came up with the concept of impact or perish, and I would show them that the donor community and the public is losing confidence in research, in theory, without look at the practice lens, and I would show them that by being practical, by being impactful, they don't lose their scientific achievement. They don't lose their goal. They don't lose their power, scientists. And that's changed. Until now, all scientists we had in my organization, Calro, were now basically giving me, supporting me to be able to design solutions that were actually relevant to the communities, needed to the communities. And when they started getting recognized from the impact lens, everybody was moved now to try to be able to be part of what we're doing about being impact focused, being practical focused, and still not threatening their scientific goal, not threatening their promotion, their orientation, but just showing the balance between what we want to achieve and what they've been achieving over the time.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Madhavas. And unfortunately, we just ran out of time. I really wanted to hear the responses from Sarah and Banu, but we are running short on time. I want to thank everyone so much for your valuable contributions and insights. That was an excellent conversation. And Justin Bryant will now moderate the second part of the event, focused on innovative solutions for a sustainable future in Africa. Justin, you have the floor.
Many thanks, Dina, Boniface, Banu, and Sarah for a wonderfully done panel. I'm still reflecting on much of what was said. The context was so excellently laid for this next conversation that we're about to have. So thank you very much for your insights and perspectives. We're honored to have that. So hello, everybody. I'm Justin Bryant, and I lead our Sandboxes work here at the DataSphere Initiative that has began in and is rooted in our Africa Forum and Sandboxes for Data. So thank you all for being here and participating with us today. This next conversation is going to be called Innovative Solutions for a Sustainable Future in Africa, where experts are going to discuss the roles of innovative tools such as Sandboxes for Data in fostering experimentation with regards to environmental data in Africa. And just given the insights from that last panel, I want to make sure that this conversation is also rooted in community empowerment as well, because I think that was a very important theme. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce the speakers for this panel. We have with us Aditya Agrawal, who's the founder of D40 Insights, a mission-driven consulting firm focused on catalyzing data and technology programs and solutions to support international development, environment, and sustainability. Aditya is currently working on the startup of Digital Earth Pacific and is a research fellow with the Digital Impact Alliance. He has previously provided leadership, establishing numerous programs, including Digital Earth Africa, the Global Carbon Removal Partnership, the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, and ION Earth. We have with us Peter Rabley, who's the managing partner of Place, a technology executive, investor, and geographer. He spent the last 30 years creating and operating geospatial businesses that map the Earth to improve lives and protect the resources of our planet. Place is a nonprofit data trust, which he founded to make mapping more accessible and affordable so that decision makers have the data they need to improve the places around them. We welcome you. And finally, Dr. Ken Mubea is the Capacity Development Lead for Digital Earth Africa. And that provides technical support, capacity development, and user engagement, driving usage of the Digital Earth Africa services across Africa. Prior to working with Digital Earth Africa, Ken was a GIS technical manager with the Global Partnership for Sustainable Development Data, driving the usage of Africa Regional Data Cube, capacity development lead with Server, which is a USAID NASA collaboration, a lecturer at Dedan Kimathi University of Technology in Kenya, and a support engineer with ESRI Eastern Africa, and as a geographic consultant with Google Kenya. So thank you all for being here. There's a lot of synergies between your backgrounds, and I think you probably all know each other as well. And so I'd actually like to start with Ken, who has a presentation for us on Digital Earth Africa, and then we'll move into the questions after that. So Ken, please, you have the floor.
Thank you so much, Justin. I think I'd seen it on my site, or you have it on your site as well.
Would you like me to share your slides?
Yes, please. So as the background, the program started 4 years ago, and the opportunity here is has been that of providing Earth observations, unlocking the various potentials, and supporting the various countries. And before the program started with Aditya, we had a pilot program as well, covering 5 countries, and this informed the greater need for the whole continent. In the next slide now, just giving you a simple diagram, is that we've been working with different partners. We are powered by Amazon Web Service, who are also in Cape Town, and our program is currently hosted by the South African National Space Agency. And we are working with these partners across the continent to develop amazing continental services. We have the water, we have the coastlines, we have the cloud free mosaics, and all this is powered by the partnerships, and also even developing an online learning platform. And now moving to the next one is just to summarize the data sets that we have from the space agencies. And these are in analysis ready format, courtesy of what is described by the Committee of Earth Observation Satellites. So it means here you just come in and just click, and you're able to get data for any country. Africa, you're able to look at the coastlines, you're able to look at the water observation from space covering over 35 years. You're able to use the Sentinel-2 at 10 meters. You're even able to use the cloud mosaics of yearly, looking at how much has changed. Just some of these examples from Tanzania, Egypt, Rwanda to Namibia. All this program was most centered into responding to the national development agendas of the countries, as well as the Sustainable Development Goals, and trying to use Earth observation to help the countries respond on these. And in the next slide, you'll be able to see how it's easy to access the platform. There was a lot of co-development, having a user interface where it's easy for everybody, and having the sandbox for more analysis. And also the platform can be connected to any GIS environment software. And also we have a free online platform in English and French, just to support the diversity and inclusion, and also looking at further opportunities of going to Portuguese and possibly Arabic in the next future. Then in the next slide now, this is how simple the sandbox is. We have various notebooks. All of these are easy to run. And also we have tutorials that we run every week in English and French, just to unpack this quite information from how you can analyze crops, how you can look at the water, how you can even look at how you can forecast vegetation, and how you can also monitor some changes in the urban, trying to connect very much with various partners, as well as the custodians of the various SDG indicators. Now in the next slide, now you're able to see some of the stories we've been able to have impact stories, even some of them making stories on the BBC. This one was a relocation of giraffes in Lake Baringo in Kenya, where we had some floods, and the giraffes were stuck somewhere in an island where they have been conserved the last 50 years, and they had to be taken to a safe sanctuary. And they were using our platform to simulate the changes in the water extent, as you can see. And now we're able to provide a safe sanctuary for where they can actually coexist with the communities. Also looking in the next one, now in the next slide, another story from the Okavango, just in Botswana, serving 3 countries and working with one of the professors to show the changes over time, show where there was a drought and show where there were floods. And currently the lake is almost drying because of climate change. And this also responding to the SDG 6, trying to empower countries on how easy to access the Earth observations through this platform and other complementary efforts. And now in the next one, just as a summary, a story in Zanzibar, how we're helping communities in, they can use Earth observation to conserve mangroves. And in this one, we went step by step, working with the government and working with the universities, and the universities working with the students as part of the Youth Papa Network, and also now the students working with the community to share the information, unpacking what is available from the platform to actually what is on the ground in terms of validation and in terms of what they can coexist with the community in terms of restoration, so that we leave no one behind. And now in the next slide, it's just some of the training courses that we have in English and French. And also we are open to organize virtual sessions with you or face-to-face, so that we continue to work as part of the, supporting SDGs and other development agendas. And in the next slide is acknowledging the partners who've made the program so far, Australian government, the support, Helmsley Trust, as well as other partners who've supported this as far. And in the last slide is just our contacts, and I believe the data spheres will be able to share the slides and information so that they can connect with you. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you very much for that, Ken. And so I'll begin the questions, and I'll start with you since we just went through your presentation. First off, I guess I'd love to understand how, firstly, how governments are engaging with the resources and the data provided by the Digital Earth Africa effort. And on that point, as far as I know, there have been no regulatory or operational sandboxes convened by a government on the African continent to date to deal with issues of climate and sustainability. And so I'm wondering how the potential of a regulatory or operational sandbox or other experimental efforts convened by government could help unlock insights toward resolving some of the diverse environmental challenges based on the continent of Africa.
Thank you for your question. First of all, is that the work we've done so far has been borrowed from what we learned from the Global Partnership, UN Foundation and others, that of supporting existing data ecosystems. So the various countries that we've worked, like Senegal, Kenya, and the others, there was already a mechanism of which the government has already set up key actors and who is a custodian. And the platform like the Digital South Africa was just a complementary in that end, that we are empowering this ministry to respond on water challenges. We are supporting even where Boniface Akuku was at the Ministry of Agriculture, supporting them in that aim of crop yield estimation and how much information is required. And where we have gaps in terms of high resolution, which we don't really have, we connect them with other commercial partners like Planet and Maxa. So it's more of the support. And also now over the years, as we started also as part of our governance, we have the African Union as part of our governing board, and they give us the guidelines. And also we are trying to synergize with them because they already have another project called the Global Monitoring of Environment and Security, where we've seen we have synergies based on the continental services that we have. And now we actually work with them to have more buy-in of more member states so that we leave no one behind. Thank you.
Thank you, Ken. Aditya, I'll move to you and ask a similar question. How can we utilize regulatory sandboxes or operational sandboxes or other experimental efforts to help unlock insights from some of the data being collected in Digital Earth Africa and these other sort of mapping projects that seem to be occurring on the continent?
Yeah, thanks, Justin. And what a great setup. Thanks, Ken, for setting me up really well here. I'd like to say that was by design, but it just kind of worked out well that way. So nice to see you again, Ken. And I guess the way that I would kind of approach this question broadly is that, you know, the approach that we've taken with the programs that we've worked on that you previously mentioned, Justin, is that we have to be very demand driven, really kind of focusing in on what the needs and challenges are that countries are facing and developing an infrastructure and products that meet those needs through inclusive governance, capacity development, stakeholder engagement, and co-design principles, many of the things that were spoken to in the previous panel, which I completely agree with. Fundamentally, with all the investment that goes into these programs, it's all going to be wasted if we're not getting these products and services being taken up and used and driving meaningful action towards decision making and policy. As Ken had mentioned in the case of Digital Earth Africa, before that, there was a prototype that was launched for 5 countries, which were Senegal, Sierra Leone, Ghana, Kenya, and Tanzania, called the Africa Regional Data Cube. And that was based on a consultative approach over a number of years, thinking about how national data ecosystems could be developed at the country level in support of national development priorities and the Sustainable Development Goals. And fundamentally, like during that time, you know, we were able to build a lot of relationships and trust with decision makers across countries and align against common challenges as those countries face, such as deforestation, climate change, disaster risk reduction, food security, and others. And these were all issues that Earth observations could readily address and do it at scale. But you know, some of the common challenges were not in place when it came to being able to access that type of data, the capacity that was required, and how you'd be able to better use that information. So in many ways, the Africa Regional Data Cube itself was a test case to better understand how that type of capability could be utilized on the continent. And from that perspective, the advancements that were being put into place by using Open Data Cube technology, a sandbox environment, shareable Jupyter notebooks. The ARDC was an opportunity for users to start testing that technology for their own needs and further adapt it and develop it and use different types of notebooks and algorithms that addressed pressing challenges. So the ARDC in many ways was a sandbox environment that led to how Digital Earth Africa could then be scaled, because we knew that there was more demand for how this technology could go beyond those 5 countries. And so then we worked with Geoscience Australia and the group on our Earth observations to create the business case for Digital Earth Africa. That got funded, was launched a year later. But then, you know, again, like the important point here is that being able to kind of approach these large you know, continental-wide programs and solutions in a way that you're able to really sort of test the approach through a sandbox type of an approach that really has, like, you got to have like some fundamental mechanisms in place that includes things like inclusive governance. You know, we did this in a multi-stakeholder approach that both provided high-level buy-in and technical expertise that allowed for gaining political momentum and trust around the initiative itself, while making sure that we were aligning to other programs that already existed in the continent. We were leveraging capacity that already existed on the continent, and we could work with governments and civil society organizations and the private sector around what new possibilities could occur through that kind of a partnership that would lead to further alignment and innovation, transparency, and accountability.
Thanks so much, Lucio. Peter, I'll have you step in and maybe just respond to some of what Ken and Aditya have said with your own experience.
Yeah, no, thanks, Justin, and thanks for inviting me here. What's new is old, and what's old is new again. So I'll point out that the longest running USAID program, something called FuseNet, created in 1985, doing many of the same things that are being done now, with several $1 billion worth of funding over the years. Has it made a material difference? Have others learned from the pluses and minuses of FuseNet and built it into other programs? I'll leave that as an open question. My own thought is probably not.
Peter, if for those of us who aren't familiar, could you kind of break down a little bit of what FuseNet was aiming to do? Because I'm personally not familiar with it, and I'd love to understand a little bit more about how that feeds into this context.
So FuseNet came about because of devastating famine in East and West Africa in 1985, and the US government decided that it needed an early warning system to predict and get ahead of humanitarian crises, particularly related to food security. And so using satellite data at the time, as well as ground observations, it set up a method by which automated monitoring could be done, forecasting could be done, the data could be shared, and a network of local organizations throughout the continent, particularly in those areas with high food security, would contribute to that and would be part of the learning and procedural process. You can go to fuse.net, and there's a plethora of data and information. So I always sort of use it as a cautionary marker about, and also that because we have new technology, that we have a new solution and a new approach. I think Boniface probably spoke about some of the more useful elements of what makes things work or not work, which are incentives and, frankly, funding. You know, we're not going to get beyond pilots, and I sort of call it pilotitis. And unfortunately, as you can tell from my lack of hair, I've been around for a while, and I have seen so many pilots and so many well-meaning sort of programs and projects that seem to repeat the same thing, but because of the funding source they have, which is always time limited, there's sort of a spurt and an interest, and everyone uses it as an example. So I use Fuse as an example of a cautionary tale that we don't seem to have really learned much and address the root issues. The second thing I'd want to do is, and I guess I'm going to play the curmudgeon here, but is not to over-index on community engagement and design. The problems we're facing are significant and are with us now. We need to move at pace and at scale. I live in the US. I'm lucky enough to live in the US. I am not engaged as a community member in the technology that is applied to me by my various forms of government. I would caution that we apply the same idea that has to be a consideration, and I stress has to be a consideration. Sometimes we need to move faster. I've also dealt with organizations. My particular focus is in the urban sector, and there are groups that work with slums, for example, that collect data and then do not share the data. Consider that data to be proprietary and want others to pay for that data because they see it as a source of revenue. And I can understand why they would do that, because it is a reaction to being poked and prodded for 3 decades with people coming in and asking them to collect data about themselves, which they then benefit from. So they've turned it around and said, if you want our data, you're going to have to pay for it, which is not a great outcome as well. So again, just a cautionary tale about this idea of engagement and sort of community tooling and data. I think we need to be more rigorous in that, what really works. But for me, the issue is funding. You have to have funding coming from somewhere that is continual, doesn't just create data in one cycle, but is there to consistently maintain that data. So I'll stop there. Yes, I've probably thrown more than a few darts at the dartboard there for you.
I think you have, and that kind of, so I want to go back to you for my next question, Peter, right? I take what you say about not over-indexing on necessarily including everybody, given the urgency of what we're facing in the climate space and the fact that we're, you know, even if we do everything right now, we're still unlikely, you know, to meet our targets in this area, right? And that point is well taken, right? So I guess from your perspective, right, what is the ecosystem of players that works to have the speed that we need and do things properly, right? What is the role of kind of cross-sectoral or collaborative partnering in fostering this ecosystem that can scale innovative climate solutions that we need to be able to create the advancements that are necessary at this point?
Right. Well, as a geographer, I'm biased, and scale and context matter. because what works in one place at one scale may not work in another place. So what I'll do is I'll answer your question of climate in the lens of urban, and in particular African urban environments, which are the most rapidly growing in the world and are the least planned and least developed. So in African cities particularly, and it depends on where you are, West African cities are far more at risk of flooding than they are, say, in Southern and Southeastern Africa. But if we take climate in West Africa in the urban context, then flooding and heat and mobility are the three biggest sort of issues, and the construction using cement. So if you look at the load on climate, if you will, that's coming from African cities, we need data at the scale of the African city, and we need data at a pace that is keeping up with the rate of change of African cities, which is double. Every city in Africa on average is doubling in size every 7 to 8 years. Right, and Kinshasa is projected to be the world's largest city by 2100. Okay, and Africa will soon tip into the most populous continent in the world by about 2050. So the context for solutions at a city level, at a rapidly urbanizing level in Africa, you need different data than you do for looking at famine early warning systems across rural agricultural scales, which can be serviced by Earth observation and the wonderful work that Ken and Digital Earth Africa are doing. But they can't look inside the cities where this different level of climate activity is hitting and happening. So you have to engage an ecosystem at the city level, which is very different than, say, the farming community at regional scale.
That makes a lot of sense, Peter. Ken, I'd love to hear your thoughts on kind of the right coalition to develop to move at the requisite speed for the climate challenges that we're seeing on the continent. If we can't include everybody, who should be there?
So based on the background of the program, Digital Earth Africa, and where we started with the data ecosystems at the UN Foundation, is that we've been searching for champions in these different countries and ministries. So for example, I see in this call, we have someone from Senegal Statistics, for example. So these champions, like the case of Tanzania, was a story that we could speak, that we had a champion at the National Bureau of Statistics who was using the platform and responding to a drought and flood situation just next to the capital city. And the way we packaged the information was like monitoring the floods around Lake Sulunga, one of the key highlights. And we had very good high political level connections. The former president who was there, and as part of the statistics for 2020, 2019, we were able to support their documents that they require data on various factors. They required data on various indicators that they could get more funding. And that was one of the success stories, that we had a champion who was driving the program. Looking at other countries like Kenya, we had the Kenya Space Agency, who were actually supporting other ministries and departments in their various sectors. And the last 1 year or 2 years, they have been organizing thematic areas in urbanization, in agriculture. So they're trying to work differently. The case of Rwanda is the same, where we have very good high-level political engagement, and we are working with the Rwanda Space Agency, and they're responding very well, because then they need the technology, but they are really ready for the technology. Where we are based now in South Africa, it's a little bit different, because we have different actors, the big country as well, and there have been also various ecosystems because of the history of different ways. But now, looking closely to the disasters that were there in 2022, flooding in Durban, everyone was looking around, can this one help? Can this one help? So there was quick around. Even we had high resolution imagery from Maxa supporting that story. And even last year, I developed a story with a journalist using our platform to show how the sea level rise were really affected, and how effects of climate change are to the Southern East community in South Africa, in Durban. So helping people democratize the information, but the champions are the key people, and also looking at the whole continent, the diversity of language, where even a Francophone, Anglophone, and also in the case of Angola and Mozambique, Portuguese. And recent conversations now we had with a colleague from Mozambique. They are having a cyclone which comes around early the year, January, and they are looking for a platform which can show them some impacts of how they can actually prepare best. So we have the platform, but we are using such an opportunity like today to reach out to more champions in the continent so that we leave nobody. Thank you.
Thanks, Ken. And Aditya, I'd like to give the question to you as well in terms of your experience with coalition building and success on that front. And or failure, if you have that as well.
Yeah, no, thanks, Justin. I mean, I think I think this is a really good question, and one where I would say that we haven't quite figured it out. I think it's probably been one of the things that's been most frustrating for me, in the sense that, I would say in, both Digital Earth Africa and Digital Earth Pacific, other big programs that are institutionalized within big institutions, the idea has always been to, sort of move forward with a multi-stakeholder approach where you are creating these public-private partnerships, you're engaging with governments and private sector and civil society in a way that there is accountability and transparency, but then there's also innovation taking place as part of that effort. However, because these programs are big, there's lots of bureaucracy within the institutions where these programs are hosted. The pace of innovation is often not what you want it to be. And I certainly agree with Peter that we do need to move fast, but there is also a cultural and there's a cultural issue across many of the countries that we work in as well, where if you are bringing in something from the outside and there isn't the right level of engagement that's happening with stakeholders and governments and so forth, that the trust building process is incredibly important for anything to be then taken up and used. And so trying to find the right balance, the right sort of business model between how do we initiate these big programs that are meant to scale, that we're really trying to get the usage and take up of these data products and services in a way that they are driving meaningful impact, in a way that it's very responsive to the needs and challenges of those user communities, but at the same time, we are trying to be agile, we are trying to be innovative, we are trying to move things quickly. There does need to be a balance that sort of addresses all of those pieces, but it, I think, really comes back to the institutions within which these programs are hosted and how agile those institutions can be in being able to then, move at a pace and a scale that's, speaks to the reality of where we are right now.
Thank you, Aditya. I guess I'll do what I did last time and also reverse and come back to you with this next question as well, because I think what you said makes me think of my next question, which kind of ties into some of what Boniface was expressing earlier. But I'd love to get your sense of what the role of these communities are in bringing these efforts to life, right? And making these communities across the continent aware of the value of these solutions, right? So obviously you have those key stakeholders who are going to be, driving the projects and trying to create that speed. But there is a role for these communities to play as well, right? In terms of being aligned, receiving, understanding how they can plug in some level. And so I'd love to hear from you what you might see as the role of these communities being.
Yeah, I mean, if by definition the communities that we're talking about here are those that are going to be the recipients of some of these services that are being put out there, the things that we've talked about previously when it comes to co-design, we need to really leverage local knowledge and expertise in the development of these products and services. Often algorithms or methods are coming in from other parts of the world. And while 60-70% of that algorithm might be applicable to the new place that it's trying to be implemented, they need to be locally adapted for that particular region. And a lot of that knowledge comes from local expertise. I think there was somebody else that commented on validation previously. So thinking about data validation and bringing in local data as part of that process, where citizen science can support data validation processes. And then really looking at capacity development. I think Boniface was speaking much to this issue. capacity needs to be increased, and there's many different ways to really think about holistic capacity development, where different organizations can be embedded within the programs themselves to have on-the-job type of training that really sort of builds up their skill sets and takes that skill set back to their own organization, and other capacity development approaches where you're really creating user communities around the infrastructure that you're developing in a way that it really becomes a peer-to-peer group. What you really want is stories and lessons learned, and really giving a platform for everyone that is engaged in that type of a technology to talk about what they're doing. It's really about them and giving them a platform to share the, the issues, the challenges, the opportunities, the successes, and so forth that they're experiencing moving forward. And that in itself becomes a huge learning experience for everyone.
Thanks, Aditya. Ken, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the question as well, in terms of how you've seen the role of these communities working into Digital Earth Africa as well.
I think we've been working with, primarily started with the governments, et cetera, but what we realized was working as well first was the youth mappers, and with that we are looking at our strategy on diversity and inclusion. Then on the various several years ago, I was also a lecturer in the university, so I could see the gaps, the curriculum, and we had something set up earlier last year with the youth mappers, setting up a technical challenge for them to come to the platform and share some of the stories in their communities. For example, we had Uganda students from Makerere University looking at the deforestation in certain areas and how they work with communities. There was another case in Malawi where they had a similar story on deforestation. Then we also had a similar story on water management and climate in Sierra Leone. And the other one was Tanzania. That was with the Youth Mapper Network, which covers it's like the UN. Most countries have the Youth Mapper Network, and it's very amazing. Because these are the guys who will be the evangelists of the what amazing work we are doing, and maybe they'll be actually, one of them will be the president of some country very soon. Then also we have, in terms of diversity and inclusion, another virtual network of Africa women in GIS in Africa, and we partnered with them as well just to have a technical, build up the skills and them using the platform and how they can use it for their communities. And we had a story from Nigeria, mapping mangroves in Nigeria, Niger Delta. And actually this particular lady now has finished her PhD from New Zealand. And the other one was from South Africa, looking at various human settlements and climate change. So the dimension of the youth, I think, is the one which, if we add more voice, we'll be having more, they'll be able to make more noise to the politicians as well, because they're really listened to. And looking at Africa now, we have 70% the youth. Look at Nigeria, look at South Africa, look at Kenya, look at Morocco. There's a lot of advocacy, there's a lot of access to internet. Some of them are using our platform, the learning courses, the online. They're connecting with us virtually. They're telling us how they intend to use the platform. And also there are countries that we really want to connect to, like Cape Verde. So this network is what will help us build and even share the lessons like what Aditya is sharing about the Digital Pacific. It's something also we are learning, and also helping other data cubes and sandboxes and bringing all the platforms to empower the governments ultimately. Thank you.
Yeah, I really appreciate your perspective on the youth. It's really difficult to have this conversation without mentioning youth and the energy that they have for climate change and seeing this sustainable future realized. So that's really great that you have them involved with Digital Earth Africa, as they should be involved with these efforts to the extent possible. Peter, want to give you a similar question, kind of speaking to community, so you can address that a little bit. But I'm particularly interested in what you said earlier, kind of about the diverse strategies that are needed for more famine-based areas or non-urban rural zones, right, where the GIS mapping is going to be more useful in terms of data intervention versus like the urban centers, and what sorts of data points and sets and interventions might be best to help with the urban crises and sustainability that we're seeing versus the rural ones that are more facilitated through the efforts like Digital Earth Africa and things like that.
Yeah, so thanks, Justin. So in GIS and mapping, we talk about scale, and you know what this looks like, because when you're zoomed out looking at, say, all of the US, it looks nice and sort of crisp. And then as you zoom in, if the data is not very high resolution, it breaks up into blocks, right? And you don't see the local level. So resolution and scale in mapping are very important. And the costs typically are astronomical as you go down in scale and you look inside the city. The collection at that scale is typically much more expensive on a per kilometer basis than it is for, say, mapping agricultural areas or countries or regions and zones where satellites, free satellites like the Sentinel systems or the Landsat systems, provide this wonderful open data that requires just processing to make actionable insights from. This is very different. So you need different types of sensors, you need different types of data collection, and you also need to see what's going on in the urban environment from the street level. It's not enough just to look down, because one of the problems is you can't necessarily tell what that building is and who's in there and what they're doing. And is it 2 stories or 3 stories? And is the first floor a dry goods store and the second floor is a set of apartments? When you're working at a municipal level and delivering services like public works, education, public safety, flood zones, you have to work at that scale within the city. That's the challenge. And you need different data and different sensors. So again, the context becomes very, very different, right? So just to give you an idea in terms of how scale works, and you need different methods of collection. I personally think community is a loaded word, and I think people tend to have a very strong idea of a group of sort of people coming together almost in a commune-like fashion to work on issues. I prefer the idea of products and users and an ecosystem, because what your product is that you're offering and who is the consumer of that product and in what way, I think is a much more reasonable way to think about sustainable, innovative, rapid types of applications, right? As opposed to we're going to go out and canvass the community to see what they think, and they're going to help design the interface of this product. So I'm a little more hard-nosed around what is your product and what problem is it solving and for whom. And so I think talking in those terms allows us to be a little sharper about engagement.
Understood. Something that you said that had me thinking was, you know, in terms of the level of granularity that is necessary to you know, to map what you need to on the city level, right? Coming from where I sit, you know, it immediately kind of triggers the, okay, surveillance, privacy, data protection questions, you know, that I think about, right? And in terms, I guess, I'm sure you've engaged with this, and I'm thinking, like, how do you square, right, that demand from users, right, for this data protection, for this privacy, and a lack of feeling of surveilled, especially in countries where you know, the relationships of individuals and government might be quite tense, with the need to achieve what we need to in terms of sustainability and you know, the granularity of the data that we need to collect.
Yeah, it's a very good question. So my answer is, how do you square it, Justin? You live in the city of San Jose. They collect that data right now. Have you gone to any municipal meetings and said, I don't want this? How dare you collect this level of data about me? Because they fly aerial photography every year in San Jose, and they drive around doing mobile mapping in far greater scale than I'm talking about. So this was to my earlier point of not imposing or not understanding how things are working in our environment. So I'll just level set at that. But our answer is, you have to take that very seriously. You have to take de-identification of data very seriously. And in our place model, what we do is, this is why we don't make that data open by default, by the way, because there is opportunity for harm at the scale at which we're collecting data. And unfortunately, we had a bad example with the Sentinel project about 10 years ago out of Harvard with the janjaweed in Sudan with high resolution satellite imagery, where the janjaweed used that open data to target where the aid workers were and kill them. and developed something called the Sentinel Code as a result. So we've built in, you have to be an organization in good standing and agree to the terms and principles of being a member of place to access this data, which is de-identified, meaning the faces and license plates are blurred out at the street level. And then we have a governance committee made up of members that can hear complaints about any of the members that have misused the data, and they can have their access to the data turned off, or they can be kicked out of the membership entirely. So we've tried to think very carefully. Now, no system is foolproof. If somebody really wants to, particularly if it's a pernicious external state actor, they'll have the sophistication to get around some of these things. But what you can do is put in as many reasonable steps to try and drive what good looks like, and have some reasonable punishment, which is you no longer have access to the data, as a way to try and drive good behavior. So that's how we're trying to deal with that and be very cognizant of it. What I will say is the level of data we collect from the air is 5 centimeters. So each pixel or square is 5 centimeters. So anything bigger than 5 centimeters can be identified from the imagery that's collected. And we already know that that data can identify things like laundry hanging up in the back in the tenement area. And if your clothing is of a particular pattern, you can identify potentially a group, an ethnic group. And you could potentially say this ethnic group lives in this part of the city that you otherwise didn't know before. So it's real. This is not, and I give you a hard, real example of how somebody might apply machine learning to that level of data to identify an ethnic group they otherwise didn't know where they were, and then potentially target them. So these are real concerns that have to get built in, and our community, our members, help us design the governance mechanism around the data that we collect and provide to them. That's how we look at engaging it, but we give them a time limit. And we say, you've got 3 weeks, you're going to sit and work on this, and we keep moving. And if things need to be adjusted, we'll adjust it over time. But we're not going to sit around for a year and try and figure this stuff out. We're going to come up with good enough to get started. So
thanks, Peter. No, that was really insightful. Thank you very much. At this point, I want to turn it over to the audience to ask questions of any of the panelists. We have a question in the Q&A section right now that speaks to the funding point that was raised earlier, asking what funding opportunities are there for those of us who are collecting and disseminating hyperlocal meteorological and climate data to vulnerable communities. All we hear about are government-led initiatives, and this creates massive data gaps. So whoever wants to take that question, feel free.
where was that question, Justin?
It was about funding opportunities. Peter, I was
Oh.
asking what funding opportunities are available for people who are collecting and disseminating hyperlocal meteorological and climate data to vulnerable communities.
So what I would say from my perspective and the way we thought about it at Place is don't look for one-off funding sources. They tend to be horrible, they tend to be bureaucratic, and they come with a lot of overhead, which means that you can't use all the money you might raise to do what you really want to do, which is collect that hyperlocal data. What I would say is there are commercial entities who would very much want access to that data. Insurance companies, businesses that serve those insurance companies. So how can you design a method by which your collection of the data in the public interest can also be then sold on an ongoing basis to commercial entities who will license that data from you? I don't think when we look at sustainable data ecosystems that you can disconnect the desire of private sector to pay for that data. I think that's a much more sustainable and reasonable way of funding the collection of that data, which then services the community. But you're going to have to give access to that data to those that can make then insurance decisions, investment decisions, and others. So The answer is I wouldn't look at the classic funding opportunities and bids and projects. I would look to see if you can build your own sustainable model.
Thanks, Peter. Anybody else want to chime in on that question? If not, we have another, so that's okay. The next question from the same participant is for you, Ken. And this person is asking, are you considering AI and other emerging technologies to enhance the accuracy of climate data? And if so, how?
So the platform relies on open satellite data, the sources that we have from the European Space Agency, Sentinel-1 and 2. This is just Earth observation. And we also have the USGS Landsat 5, 8, 7, 9 at 30 meters. Then on the climate data, we connect to the European data, UMSAT, where we have CHAPS data. So it's the same system which also feeds to some of the work like was alluded to in terms of HughesNet. How we use AI is actually now in the sandbox to make the algorithms actually work in terms of machine learning. So one of the prototypes has been that of trying to do a proper crop type mapping. And something we started with the FAO for some countries. We had Lesotho, Rwanda, and there was also Mozambique. So these are just in the works. And we are also thinking about holding some hackathons late in the year where we could also have the young people chipping in their technology to use the platform. So it's more of the Earth observation to see the trends over time and using the AI and machine learning to do some predictions with the images. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Okay, I think that's about all the questions we have. I'll hand it back to the panelists for some final thoughts. And I guess there's one more. Oh, there's one more. I guess contribution in the chat, just talking about the strategy that we're discussing here, and the importance of community empowerment on data governance, including data regulation, security and privacy considerations, and identifying major data use cases in communities. So Dave wanted to mention that. So yeah, any closing thoughts from the panelists before we wrap up?
So from the Digital South Africa, the platform is open, free and open source, and also we are working closely with the various partners to scale up to all these countries in Africa, just being politically correct, and then also working with existing initiatives. I know the Digital Impact Alliance, I had some of the work, and I also know my colleague Karen at the Global Partnership, they're doing some activities. So it's to see more of alignment so that we can have some more impact stories and also continue to engage the different governments. And in these governments, we are looking for champions, because once you have one champion in one country, things are able to move fast. This has been the lessons that we've learned, but there's a lot of dynamics in different countries. And also most of the work we do, we also look at the election cycles in different countries. Some of these countries, like this year, we have like 4 or 5, including our very own South Africa. So there's dynamics, but we still continue to engage with different stakeholders so that you never know, you engage with someone, then they are transferred to another office, and also not missing out the young people in terms of how, now they're more involved. They have access to the internet. They're also looking for jobs, and this is part of the digital, building their ecosystems. Thank you.
Should I go next, Justin?
Go ahead, Aditya.
Well, first, let me just say thank you for having me. Really appreciate it, and nice to speak with everyone. I guess what I would say is maybe a couple of things. Like one, I'm still a believer in open data and what open data can do to generate data ecosystems and innovation, and also sort of drive the right kind of partnerships that are needed between governments and private sector and civil society and so forth. Creating those kinds of partnerships is often difficult. And in my experience, governments don't know how to speak to the private sector, and private sector doesn't know how to speak to governments. And that's where the opportunity also lies in being able to sort of create a bridge there to really facilitate those types of discussions. Engagement for me in the work that we've done across several of these programs has often been very important, because again, I would just say that it all depends on context and it all depends on the business model, but having trust and relationship as a way to then sort of drive a program forward and what that means for uptake and usage around those products has often been very important. And yeah, I mean, maybe I'll just leave it at that and just say that, creating these kinds of ecosystems, creating these kind of opportunities where you are able to experiment and test through sandboxes and pilots and so forth, it's not easy. It usually takes a lot of time, but there's different ways to kind of apply it in a way that hopefully we can get to some more agility and scale and timeliness around this. I mean, I'll just say this one example. I won't mention the institute, but essentially a program that we were working on, one comment came back that was essentially indicating that we're basically hijacked by our procurement department. They basically dictate the level of innovation that our entire institution can work under. And that's I think for me, like, that's the main sort of thing that we need to fix, because within these institutions, there's lots of great people that want to do really innovative things at scale and at pace, but it's the institution that's really keeping that from happening. And so how do we change that?
Thanks, Aditya. And Peter, if you have any thoughts, we'd love you to wrap up for us.
Yeah, just really quickly, I think, we're living in a hyper-connected, hyper-moving world, and the institutions and structures we've had in the past are not the right ones to take us forward. That's obvious. You can describe it as a new business model, a new institutional structure, new funding mechanisms. But clearly, that's where I think the innovation has to come, not on the technology, not on data collection, not on models. I think we're all well and good there. There's tons of that stuff. The really hard thing is, how do you create an institutional structure that is sitting in between the private sector and failed public good institutions? And I think the big opportunity going forward is in new institutions built around data and innovation, and funding models for those. So I'll just leave it there.
Thank you so much, Peter. Before we close, thank you for everybody who showed up and who spoke. This was a wonderful discussion. I'd like to quickly share the results of the Menti that you did earlier. So Natalia has brought that up. Just on these questions here. So the audience, in terms of the question, climate data is readily available in my region on a scale of 1 to 5, 2.5, so kind of right in the middle. So very interesting. But to the second question, the available climate data is relevant to my community's needs. That was a 3.6. So it seems that we are grateful for the data that we do have. I'm confident that the available climate data is accurate and reliable for use in planning and adapting to climate change. Not very confident overall at a 2.2 here. So it's interesting, the interaction between the second and third question. People think that the data is relevant, but are not confident that it is reliable. And then the final question, the current climate data is helpful in implementing practical solutions for addressing climate change challenges in my community, 3.1. So that's interesting too. And apparently from my insights in the data, the average is 3 here, but our selection was bimodal. So we have a lot of people on the low end and a lot of people on the high end. So interesting in terms of those results. So thanks everybody for participating in that. I want to hand it over to Lorraine for some final words.
Thank you so much, Justin. And it's interesting to look into this last question, because people may have different interpretations on what the current climate is, right? What does it mean? And some may be more optimistic and others more pessimistic in terms of how it's going, or how it's been before. And so interesting insights there. Thank you so much for participating and for sharing with us your time. I really liked the common thread between the conversation in terms of looking towards community and also innovation. I agree completely with the notion that we need new institutions to address a problem that is extremely complex. We look into the data sphere, and the reason why we call ourselves the Data Sphere Initiative is to understand that this new space where we are is not simply the collection of all the data, but also its complex interaction with norms and with actors as well. And institutions lie in the middle of that, right? And we need to be able to create spaces to experiment with those new institutions. And that's what sandboxes are about. There's certainly not a silver bullet to solve every problem, but I'm a believer that we need new methods, more agile processes to be able to iterate and test what works and what doesn't with shorter feedback loops, right? Typically, it's not how public institutions work. They work with long feedback loops in terms of creating regulation and policies. And so trying to hack that process in terms of creating that space for multi-stakeholder cooperation when we're looking towards sandboxes, and regulatory sandboxes being one of them, operational sandboxes being another, is a way to go about this. And we'd like to see more of those initiatives all over the world. This project is inscribed in this roundtable is inscribed within the African Sandboxes Forum, but we do have plans to launch a global Sandboxes Forum in the middle of this year. And the idea there is to create that space to share experiences across different regions in the world. We've been doing a lot of work in Latin America as well, talking to the Europeans and North Americans equally. And the idea is to create that space where we can see more of those efforts and more of sharing and capacity enhancement as well in this issue. I thank you all for your time. And we're always open for different suggestions on topics and roundtables as well, and for sharing your resources as well. We're going to share the summary of the conversation that we've had. I think was very rich. There are many resources that were shared here, and I just wanted to deeply thank for all your time and for sharing your expertise with us. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Bye-bye.